The air inside the sleek, corporate offices of Metro Court was usually thick with tension, but on this particular morning, the atmosphere felt positively lethal. Michael Corinthos stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out over the bustling Port Charles harbor, his mind racing with a chaotic mixture of panic and calculation. For months, he had operated under the assumption that he could maintain absolute control over the chessboard of his family's empire and his increasingly fractured personal life. He had convinced himself that his motives were pure, that protecting the Corinthos legacy and keeping his family insulated from the underworld's encroaching darkness was worth every moral compromise. But the latest intelligence to cross his desk had completely shattered that illusion, delivering a shock so profound it threatened to derail everything he had spent years building. The revelation did not come from an anonymous tip or a corporate whistleblower, but from the complex, dark web of international criminal activities currently intersecting with Port Charles, forcing Michael to face a reality where he was no longer the puppet master, but merely another piece on the board. The source of Michael's sudden paralysis was a deep-dive financial and intelligence report linking recent, anomalous transactions within ELQ and deception directly to a name that sent chills down the spines of the global intelligence community, Sidwell. The ruthless mercenary and crime lord had been extending his reach far beyond his usual territories, and the realization that Sidwell's shadow now loomed directly over Michael's closest operations was staggering. What made the shock truly devastating, however, was the dawning awareness of how deeply embedded the betrayal ran. Michael had prided himself on his ability to read people, to anticipate the moves of his enemies, and to safeguard those he loved, particularly Willow. Yet, as he stared at the encrypted digital files detailing a systematic infiltration of their corporate structures, he realized he had been completely blind. The sophisticated, calculated nature of the operation meant it could not have been executed by an outsider alone. It required intimate, insider access to the highest levels of Port Charles's elite circles, rendering his domestic security measures utterly useless. As Michael grappled with the implications of this corporate and security nightmare, a parallel storm was reaching its absolute zenith across town on Spoon Island, within the ominous, echoing stone walls of Windermere Castle. Inside the dark, subterranean tunnels and hidden chambers of the estate, a terrifying shift in power was unfolding between two men who had long operated in the dangerous margins of the law. Sidwell, known globally for his absolute lack of empathy and his transactional view of human life, had arrived in Port Charles with a singular, bloody agenda. For months, Pascal had served as Sidwell's trusted right-hand man, a fixer and butler whose cold, precise efficiency had made him indispensable in managing the complex logistics of Sidwell's criminal enterprise, including the high-stakes containment of captives like Jocelyn Jacques. But in the underworld, loyalty is a currency that depreciates instantly when survival or absolute power is on the line, and Pascal was about to learn that no amount of faithful service could protect him from becoming expendable. The confrontation in the dimly lit catacombs of Windermere was silent but intensely violent, defined by a sudden and total reversal of dynamics that left Pascal completely defenseless. Sidwell had uncovered evidence that Pascal was no longer operating purely in his employer's best interests, suspecting his right-hand man of playing a double game with local factions, specifically regarding the handling of sensitive intelligence and the custody of high-profile hostages. Without a hint of hesitation or emotional conflict, Sidwell turned on Pascal with terrifying precision, transforming from a distant director of operations into an immediate, lethal threat. The cold steel of a weapon pressed against Pascal's temples signaled the absolute end of their criminal partnership, leaving the former fixer trapped in the very shadows he had used to terrorize others. Jocelyn Jacques, trapped in a nearby concealed room after her desperate attempt to escape by rigging a ceiling lamp, could hear the muffled, chilling sounds of the betrayal from behind the heavy door, her own heart hammering against her ribs as she realized the monster guarding her door had just been replaced by an even more volatile and bloodthirsty beast. Meanwhile, a different kind of replacement was sending shockwaves through the medical and social circles of Port Charles, redefining the landscape of General Hospital and the fragile safety net surrounding the town's most vulnerable residents. The sudden, chaotic departure of Britt Westbourne, who had hastily fled the country alongside young Rocco in a desperate bid to escape the violent fallout of the waterfront shootings and the hunting gaze of the PCPD, had left a massive, critical void at the hospital. Britt's role as chief of staff and her deeply personal connections to the ongoing medical crises in town meant her absence was felt instantly, creating an emergency that the hospital board and the city's power players had to address immediately. The solution to this institutional crisis, however, came from a completely unexpected and highly controversial avenue, as a familiar figure from the past stepped into the light to claim the mantle Britt had abandoned. The decision to replace Britt with a polarizing, high-stakes medical authority was not merely an administrative choice, it was a tactical move engineered by families who needed absolute control over the hospital's resources and secrets. With patients like Jack Brennan lying incapacitated at Turning Woods in a state of chemically induced locked-in syndrome, a horrific condition secretly brought about by a paralytic drug cocktail administered by Nina Reeves and Willow, the position of chief of staff carried immense, clandestine power. The individual stepping into Britt's formidable shoes possessed both the brilliant medical mind and the ruthless pragmatic streak necessary to navigate the storm, promising to upend the delicate balance of power between the hospital, the mob, and the World Security Bureau. For families like the Corinthos and the Corinthoses, this administrative swap meant that medical records, toxicology reports, and access to highly sensitive patients would now be filtered through a brand new lens, ensuring that old secrets would be fiercely guarded while new, dangerous alliances were forged in the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of General Hospital. Back at the Corinthos estate, the initial paralysis of Michael's shock began to morph into a cold, calculating anger as he realized the sheer scale of the manipulation he was facing. The realization that Sidwell was actively pulling strings within deception, and that Tracy Quartermain and Brooke Lynn were already meeting with Rick Lansing to plot a federal audit to force the mercenary out, meant the corporate warfare was about to bleed into open, public chaos. Michael knew that if the federal authorities began digging into Deception's books, the chain reaction would inevitably expose the financial anomalies within ELQ and, by extension, his own covert operations. This forced him into a corner where he had to adopt a darker, more manipulative persona to survive, a regression to the dark Michael of old who valued leverage and strategic dominance above all else. His immediate target for containment and manipulation was none other than Willow, whose rising public profile and emotional vulnerability made her both a powerful asset and a massive liability in his defensive strategy. Michael's manipulation of Willow was subtle, insidious, and deeply psychological, designed to exploit her deepest insecurities and her fractured relationship with those around her. He began weaving a complex narrative around her, carefully dropping hints and creating scenarios that would subtly alienate her from her support system, particularly Harrison Chase. Michael's ultimate goal was to engineer a situation that made it appear as though Willow and Chase were engaged in a scandalous, highly inappropriate affair, a manufactured piece of leverage he could hold over both of them should the legal and criminal walls continue to close in on the family. By convincing Willow that she needed to distance herself from certain elements of Port Charles for her own safety and political future, he was effectively guiding her directly into a trap of his own making, completely unaware that his cold, calculated actions were being mirrored by the brutal survival tactics unfolding on Spoon Island and the high-stakes political maneuvering taking place within the walls of General Hospital. As the afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, bloody shadows across the city, the interconnected webs of deception, betrayal, and institutional upheaval grew tighter around every major player in Port Charles. Michael sat alone in his study, the glowing screen of his laptop reflecting in his hardened eyes as he finalized the next steps of his plan to neutralize the threats to his empire, his heart completely hardened against the collateral damage his survival would cause. On Spoon Island, Gen Sidwell was efficiently reorganizing his operations in the wake of neutralizing Pascal, establishing a tighter, more ruthless perimeter that left no room for error or mercy, cementing his status as the undisputed king of the shadows. And at General Hospital, the newly appointed replacement for Britt Westbourne walked the corridors with an air of absolute authority, their presence a stark reminder that in Port Charles, no position is permanent, no alliance is sacred, and the departure of one protector simply clears the path for a new, far more dangerous dynamic to take hold. Chapter 2: The Architecture of Absolute Control. The transition of power within the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of General Hospital was executed with a chilling, bureaucratic efficiency that mirrored the darker shifts occurring across Port Charles. With the position of Chief of Staff abruptly vacated by Britt Westbourne's desperate flight, the hospital board, heavily pressured by behind-the-scenes maneuvering from the city's power brokers, moved immediately to install her replacement. The choice was a deliberate calculated statement, designed to bring an ironclad sense of discipline to an institution that had recently become a battlefield for mob warfare, federal investigations, and high-stakes medical cover-ups. The new administrator walked through the grand entrance of the hospital not merely as a medical professional, but as an operative of absolute control, immediately demanding full access to the restricted archives and the high-security patient wings. For the staff on duty, the shift in leadership was instantaneous and palpable. The warm, deeply personal, if occasionally chaotic, atmosphere that Britt had maintained was replaced by a cold, metric-driven regime where every medical file, every prescription order, and every visitor log was subject to intense, unyielding scrutiny. The immediate priority for the newly installed medical authority was to establish a perimeter around the hospital's most sensitive assets, a move that carried profound implications for the hidden conspiracies currently threatening to dismantle the Corinthos and Quartermain factions. High on the list of priorities was the close monitoring of Jack Brennan, who lay incapacitated under heavy guard at the nearby Turning Woods facility, suffering from a severe, chemically induced state of locked-in syndrome. This terrifying condition, secretly engineered by Nina Reeves and Willow through the covert administration of a precise paralytic drug cocktail, was a ticking time bomb for everyone involved. The new Chief of Staff's first major executive order was to implement a rigorous, double-blind audit of all high-potency pharmaceuticals and experimental neurological treatments within the General Hospital network, a direct logistical threat to the cover-up Nina and Willow had so painstakingly constructed. If this new medical regime uncovered even a single anomaly in the supply chains or the toxicology protocols, the entire foundation of their desperate alliance would crumble, exposing them to both federal prosecution and the lethal wrath of the World Security Bureau. While the hospital adapted to this rigid new command structure, the fallout from Jen Sidwell's brutal purge on Spoon Island was actively reshaping the criminal underworld. Within the ancient, damp stone walls of Windermere Castle, the total elimination of Pascal as Sidwell's right-hand man had created a vacuum that Sidwell filled with terrifying speed. He did not hire from the local syndicates or rely on the fragmented remnants of the Port Charles underworld. Instead, he deployed his own highly trained, international tactical assets to secure the perimeter of the estate, turning the historic castle into an impenetrable fortress. Sidwell's betrayal of Pascal was a masterclass in preemptive ruthlessness, sending a clear message to any local factions who believed they could negotiate or play double games with his organization. From her hidden confinement within the castle's depths, Jocelyn Jacks could feel the sudden shift in the operational rhythm around her. The footsteps outside her heavy oak door were now heavier, more synchronized, and completely devoid of the occasional, predictable hesitation that Pascal had shown, signaling to her that any hope of exploitation or escape had just become exponentially more dangerous. Outside the island fortress, the news of Sidwell's aggressive consolidation of power and his complete takeover of local logistics hit Michael Corinthos like a physical blow. The initial shock that had paralyzed Michael earlier in the day had now hardened into a cold, desperate pragmatism as he realized the sheer scale of the vulnerability facing his family's corporate empire. The revelation that Sidwell's financial tendrils were deeply intertwined with deception meant that the impending federal audit being engineered by Tracy Quartermain and Brooke Lynn, with the legal guidance of Rick Lansing, was no longer just a corporate maneuver to oust an unwanted investor. It was a fuse connected directly to a massive explosive device that would destroy ELQ. Michael knew with absolute certainty that a thorough federal investigation into Deception's capital structure would inevitably uncover the irregular capital flows and covert offshore accounts he had used to stabilize his own family's assets. Faced with the total ruin of his legacy, Michael felt the final remnants of his moral hesitation dissolve, fully embracing a dark, manipulative strategy that required the total subjugation of everyone in his immediate orbit, regardless of the emotional cost. The primary instrument in Michael's dark strategy was the deliberate, systematic manipulation of Willow, whose emotional vulnerability and high public standing made her the perfect shield for his upcoming defensive moves. Recognizing that Willow's lingering feelings of guilt and her fractured relationship with Harrison Chase represented a significant variable he could not control, Michael set out to actively reshape her reality. Through a series of carefully staged conversations, manufactured crises, and altered communications, he began building a false narrative that would alienate Willow from her closest allies while simultaneously creating a devastating piece of leverage. Michael's plan was as brilliant as it was insidious. He engineered a highly sophisticated digital and situational trap designed to make it appear as though Willow and Chase were engaged in a deeply scandalous, highly inappropriate affair. By documenting and preserving this fabricated evidence, Michael ensured he possessed an absolute veto over Chase's legal authority as a detective and an unbreakable emotional leash on Willow, guaranteeing their absolute compliance should the federal authorities or Sidwell's forces break through his corporate defenses. As the evening deepened over Port Charles, the pressure inside this multi-layered trap reached a boiling point. At Deception, the atmosphere was frantic as Tracy and Brooke Lynn finalized their strategy with Rick Lansing, completely unaware that their aggressive pursuit of a federal audit was playing directly into Michael's worst nightmares and Sidwell's calculated traps. Every legal document Rick prepared to dismantle Sidwell's corporate standing was inadvertently tightening the noose around ELQ, creating a tragic paradox where the Quartermain's attempt to protect their business was actively accelerating its destruction. Meanwhile, the new chief of staff at General Hospital completed their initial sweep of the facility's security protocols, officially signing off on a new series of restrictive measures that effectively cut off Nina and Willow from accessing the medical records or the physical quarters of any high-profile patients, leaving them completely blind to whether Brennan's condition was improving or if their medical crime was on the verge of discovery. The interlocking crises culminated in a quiet, chilling moment of realization across the city's key locations. In his dark study, Michael stared at the digital dossier containing the fabricated evidence against Willow and Chase, his face illuminated only by the cold blue light of his monitor, knowing that the moment he deployed this leverage, he would permanently destroy the innocence of the woman he claimed to protect. On Spoon Island, Jen Sidwell stood on the parapet of Windmere, looking out across the black water toward the glittering lights of Port Charles, his new tactical team fully deployed and his absolute control over the regional supply lines solidified by the blood of his former partner. And within the sterile walls of General Hospital, the new era began in earnest as Britt Westbourne's name was officially scraped from the door of the Chief of Staff's office, replaced by a cold, unyielding authority that promised to hold every secret, every lie, and every player in Port Charles accountable to a brand new, terrifyingly precise standard of survival.